All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch. I'm Sébastien Bétarmier. I'm a finance faculty member here at the Desautels Faculty of Management here at McGill. I'd like to begin by thanking the team at the Lately Center for putting up this great conference. I've learned a ton so far, and it's been a pleasure to meet our panelists. We have a great panel for you this afternoon that very much has to do with following up on the discussions we had this morning on safety. We're going to do a deep dive. Now, I'm a finance faculty. I'm not an aviation expert, but my research is very much on understanding how investors behave, long-term investment decisions, and how do we ensure that corporations act in long-term responsible ways, right? In other words, how do we avoid short-term actions, right, that involve taking shortcuts at the expense of safety? And safety in the aviation industry, if we take the shortcuts, well, they kill, right? So that raises really important question about how do we ensure we're having profitable corporations that take safety first and foremost and ensuring these systems are resilient in that sense. Now, we have the best possible panel to address this topic. We have three complementary perspectives by three experts. To my left is Duff Sullivan. Duff is a professional aviator, a fighter pilot, former Major General of the Royal Canadian Air Force, has been 31 years in the Army. Thank you for your service.
Well, thank you for your kindness and consideration.
In addition, Duff has been the chairperson and presiding member of the Transportation Appeal Tribunal of Canada, which is really interesting for this panel because all the complaints that you're getting on safety, they come to you.
Yep.
So great insights to share, I'm sure.
At least they came to John and I. They came to John Graddick and I when we both served together on the tribunal.
In addition, Duff was Chief Operational Safety Officer at NAV Canada, which is in charge of the civil aviation system here in Canada, and then most recently, President at Boeing Canada. And so, great insights to share, Duff. In addition to Duff's left, well, you're right, I guess, you have Angela Gitton. Angela is the former Director General of the Airport Council International, and you did this for about 8 years, I think from 2000 to 2010 years. So very much an overall perspective on airports, and an expert very much on aviation ground services, so a great complementary perspective. In addition to that, Angela was also the CEO of the Atlanta airport. That's, I think, the busiest airport in the world. We have 10 million passengers going there every year. 90 billion? So I'm off by an order of magnitude. So I mean, a major piece of operations to look at. So, and in addition, I think you were having leadership roles as well at the San Francisco and Miami airports. San Francisco is my personal favorite. I grew up there. And then we have Scott McElvain. Scott is the Vice President of Business Development and Commercial Services at Pratt & Whitney. And on that note, I'll add that we're thanking Pratt & Whitney for, I think, kindly agreeing to sponsor the ethics case competition taking place in March here at McGill in March 2025.
Not tentatively, we have agreed.
Kindly agreed.
We really agree, yeah.
Scott is bringing the engineering perspective. Scott is an aerospace engineer, has been at Pratt & Whitney for what, 28 years, 29 years?
I'm pushing up 29 years, and then I was in the Air Force before that as an aerospace engineer. Duff and I were exchanging stories.
So you can see we have the manufacturing aspect component, we have the ground services at the airport, and then we have the on the airline with the overall operations and safety issues. So the way we'll structure this discussion, we're going to have three themes. First, latest trends on safety. What are we observing? Getting your thoughts. Then we'll move on to corporate culture. Right? How do we build strong safety-first corporate culture, and what are the issues? And then finally, again, as we've talked this morning, this is a whole ecosystem, and so how do we build, how do we take all the stakeholders into account, right, and build a safe and resilient ecosystem? And then I want to make sure we have time for Q&A from you. So on that note, I'll start with you. The same question to the three of you, and I'll start with you, Duff. What are the latest trends that you've observed that concern you on the safety issue?
Well, I think this is a great way to start off because, we've heard such great comments from all our panelists so far, and I was just holding myself back from jumping in and participating in everything that's been discussed so far. But as Sebastian said, I think from our three perspectives, over the last number of years, we have made some observations, many of them notable, and because of my role as the president of Boeing Canada, I had almost 600 Boeing suppliers under my responsibility here in Canada. And I had to get to know all those suppliers and all those companies and all those partners. But when I was with the tribunal, I was very interested whenever we would do a hearing. Is John here? Is John still here? No, he had to step out? Okay. Whenever we would have to do a hearing, go and preside over matters, and that's when the government was taking some type of enforcement action against an enterprise, a company, an MRO, an airline, or a pilot or a ship's captain. We had to familiarize ourselves with, that company. And then, oops, yeah, thank you. So I became interested in knowing how companies were structured, their governance, their leadership, their CEOs, and each individual board members, because if we were looking at an event, it's good to know the background behind the leadership and, dare I say, the ethical approach that certain companies took, whether it was an airline or an MRO and things like that. And I quite often, gee, this thing's giving me a hard time, I quite often noted that the makeup of the boards, the board of directors, and in some cases even the presidents and the CEOs that have been assigned to some of these, and Gilles, you and I talked about this earlier today, that I was always kind of wondering how they went about, finding these individuals that did not necessarily have any noticeable or notable expertise in the industry, whether it be in aviation or aerospace or engineering, but they were more focused on the business side of things, which, as we know, is very important. You've got to be an astute, competent business person to make a company viable. But I noted that in certain cases, the industry experience and expertise was sometimes perhaps not as good as it could have been. The other side of this is that whenever you do have, we'll say, a board or a leadership team that may not be all that experienced, it plays into the safety side of things, or as the word I use all the time, and you'll hear me use it quite a bit, is airworthiness. Is the company delivering airworthy capability or services to the public type thing? And then finally, the other thing, and I don't want to get too far ahead, I'm going to stop right now, but because we have another point coming up, it's to do with we've talked about CEOs in the leadership part, we've talked about the governance, like the board of directors, but the regulator and the government has a huge role to play, through legislation and regulations, and good grief, we talked a lot about that this morning and about that. But the delegation of regulatory responsibilities from the regulator out to the industry. And I won't say too much about it because I know we're going to talk about it more. But those are the main points that I kind of, observed while I was, the chair of the tribunal, and then working with Boeing and all the suppliers. I was always trying to cover those points first to get to know the company, the leadership, the governance, and dare I say, how the regulator was overseeing and regulating that part of the industry. So I'll just leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you, Duff. And we'll come back to these points, as you say. Perhaps passing over to you, Angela.
Thank you. Let me just first, put down some markers in terms of safety. We heard at the first session this morning how aviation is very heavily regulated compared to many other, if not most other industries. And I have a whole theory about that. And that is that as human beings, there are two innate fears. One is fear of falling, and one is fear of loud noises. So if you think of aviation, it hits both of those. So for us, safety, we talk about sort of the four horses of the apocalypse, well, it shouldn't be the apocalypse, but maybe four horses. At least on the airport side, Safety and security. Security is just part of safety. It's just under different auspices. Customer service, sustainability, which typically environmental sustainability, economic vitality. And economic vitality is in two ways. One, an enterprise has to make enough money to exist. But as Natalie said at the last session, an airport has to be seen as the economic engine for its community, whether it's local, national, regional, whatever. So for us, safety is and has to be seen as foundational. And you have to be very careful about trading it off against some of these other things, because we won't have any, this is on the commercial side anyway, we won't have an industry that is a form of mass transportation if the general public doesn't feel it can take its safety for granted. And so that's why you see kind of the reaction to a safety incident, let alone a full accident, in aviation that you don't see. When someone said, you know, if your BMW runs out of gas, it's not on the morning news, but it would be if it was an airplane that didn't have any gas when it was trying to take off. So in terms of what concerns the trend that concerns me as an airport person has been what I see in ground handling. You know, once the airlines started to divest themselves of that side of the business, but we're using it to cut costs. And that combined with this issue of people not coming back in the industry after COVID, so you have these shortages on the ground handling without kind of, for these companies, these various companies that are in ground handling, without them having the ability necessarily to offer good benefits. You know, there used to be, you know, you could fly, right? You had flight privileges when it was with the airline. So what is going to entice someone? And by the way, I came in yesterday through Charlotte. It was raining in Charlotte, and my luggage was out there in the rain, and everything got soaked. So in terms of employees having to work in the rain, loading baggage, that was what was going on yesterday. So that, you know, that has started to become a safety concern, a safety risk. And what ACI has been doing about that, and the industry, has started to develop a manual, started to develop best practices, and started to get airports to develop standards that they use for the ground handling companies and for the airlines at the airport, and to get more engaged. It used to be something that, you know, was something for the airlines, and the airports didn't get involved. But seeing the risk that was starting to appear even before COVID, airports have gotten more involved and now have started to engage ICAO. And I think we're getting close to ICAO coming up with some rules with respect
And
to
that
ground
externalization of ground services, are we talking about the past 2-3 years, the past 5 years, the past 10 years? Has been a slow trend?
Past 20 years. I think there's very few airlines that do their own ground handling now.
Okay. Thank you, Angela. What about you, Scott?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for the comfy chairs, because those tables didn't look so comfortable. I feel like I'm kind of like the aspiring engineer, aspiring business leader next to my two esteemed colleagues here. But
Are you calling us old?
No, I just feel a lot of wisdom. So I will try to work at that level. So I'm going to start maybe, Sebastian, with what might sound as a disclaimer, but let's call it context, okay? You know, over the many years of aviation, let's talk about modern aviation being the last 70 years, there's always been a really good collaboration space between innovation, regulation, as well as the customers and their needs. I think my concern, and I'll start with this, is that that's becoming, unfortunately or fortunately, maybe necessarily so, a little bit one-sided as everybody pushes the boundaries of technology. So let me come back to that particular thought for a second. You know, my role, and just so everybody understands what my role is, to be the optimist, to be the beacon, and to push the boundaries of the technology. I represent an engine manufacturer, right? And engine manufacturers, some would say we're the big bad wolf. We're the people that produce those things that burn fuel, but we're also the people that make sure that airplanes aren't gliders, that they actually fly, and that they get you to your destination. We also support missions such as security, firefighting, agriculture, the UN food program. So, aviation does many, many, many things worldwide, so let's not try and label aviation as just one thing. That said, our history as an industry has been built on all those lessons learned. Every accident, every incident, everything that you've seen in the news, we are outstanding at collaborating in order to extract out the fundamental DNA of what went wrong. We have taken what is a principle and turned it into an art and a science in order to progress the state of the art of safety as we know it today. And you have to define safety as following. You have to define it as achieving outcomes that achieve safety, reliability, as well as the economics that the world is looking for through powered flight. I can't remember which panelist mentioned some of the stats earlier today, but if I were to look specifically at our company, I wish I had the stats for the entire industry. Unfortunately, maybe Duff, you know this maybe better than I, but at least from our viewpoint, our products today achieve the kind of safety rate of 1.9 events per million operating hours. Okay, what's an event? Well, that's that bang or that ugly event that you're looking for. And I don't mean a crash. Like when an engine stops operating, that's not a good thing. The aircraft does turn into a glider, and sometimes those consequences can be somewhat more catastrophic. But 1.9 per million operating hours is a pretty damn good statistic. We don't stop there, but that is all based on those 70 years. So when you talk about the current technologies that are out there, and people are looking for a revolution, but ultimately, my view is that it's got to be about the evolution, because the evolution is what brought us to this point. And if you want to maintain those safety, reliability, and economic standards, we need to continue to evolve. Can we evolve faster? Absolutely, I think we can evolve faster, but people are looking for the revolution, and that's what worries me.
But so the concern, is it on the changing expectations that are becoming unrealistic, or is it perhaps that you've reached productivity level that really force now to go at the next layer of complexity to reach those gains, or potentially to decarbonize the engines? That's an additional round of complexity that is it perhaps the impatience of end-of-line consumers?
There's a big part which is impatience. Unfortunately, I think that there have been a lot of people that are trying to come into the industry, which is a very, very hard thing to do, and we should promote that. And it requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of investment. I'm not sure. I think Natalie talked about investment as well as yourself, Valerie, the need to invest. I'm not sure that the patience is there. I'm also worried about when I spend a lot of time with startups. It's part of my job. And not for the purpose of overtaking them or trying to do something different, but trying to learn from what they're doing, adapt, change, help to push the boundary. It is one of my fundamental functions. But sometimes when I sit with some of them, the stuff that they talk about, it's kind of scary. And I'm not sure they've got the depth, the expertise, the capability, and they make these promises to the public. And the public hears them and they go, oh yeah, that's going to happen next year. No, it's not. Or if it does, it's not going to be doing what people think it's going to be doing, or it's going to be doing it unsafely. And I think, unfortunately, the public is getting a very distorted view of what the art of the possible is in the near term, and that further fuels people's expectations. So that's going to put an awful lot of pressure on industry in order to move ahead, which maybe is not a bad thing. But on the other hand, we as an industry have been excellent at collaborating in order to make sure that we move ahead. Here's a little stat for everybody. In the last 70 years, engine manufacturers have improved, and I'm speaking on behalf of my competition too, have moved ahead the state of the art of the possible to the tune of 1% every year. So that's a 70% efficiency improvement. Okay, that might not sound a lot to some, but in the world of aviation, that is massive. That is massive. We will continue to do that as an industry. Again, could we evolve faster? Probably. Do we need to go find the ways to do that as an industry? Yes, but it also needs to be done prudently with safety in mind.
Thank you. So let's talk now a little bit more about corporate culture. That's huge. And let's start with Boeing. We've all seen what happened with the MAX. John alluded to it this morning. What went wrong with Boeing? I'll speak to you, Duff, since you've been at Boeing for a few years. How did we have such a jewel that ultimately went down the path of having some of the big accidents that we've seen with the MAX? And in particular, what's interesting is when you look at the public testimonials, there's evidence that the employees knew about some of those defects. And so why wasn't that information shared? Why is it that this jewel of a corporation has lost its path? If you were perhaps to summarize some of the key factors.
Well, so I'll try and be careful here, and I saw John come in, so John, you and I could end up, we'll say we could be the two marauders here. Yeah, there you go, okay. But, I guess, and what Scott said, and I'll just concur with all that the evolution or the revolution, we won't use revolution, but the evolution in propulsion has been breathtaking, really. And I will start off with that because that was part of what happened with Boeing when they took their iconic 737 and they wanted to move it from the NG, next gen, to the MAX. And so they put on these beautiful, larger, more efficient engines on their 737, but what they had to do was move the engines forward and up, okay, on the wing. And because of my engineering background, and I was an airworthiness test pilot for a good part of my career as well, I paid pretty close attention to what was going on. But I was also in the tribunal at the time. John and I were serving together back then. And I was watching what happened, in the time leading up to the two MAX 8 crashes. But there's perhaps something that that I understand that I'm happy to share with you, and that is that in every large aerospace company, and I won't go down the list, but they all have these innovation centers of excellence. They all do this. It's part of the way they try and stay one step ahead of their competition. It's how they stay relevant as they move into the future with new engines and technology. And was it Pascal? Is Pascal here? We talked about engineering earlier today. And the comparison I used to use are three numbers, 2, 3, 4. That the aircraft we're building today are half the weight as they were 30, 35 years ago. They are 3 times stronger and 4 times more durable, hence the 2, 3, 4. So that's where we are today. Add propulsion to that, and you are dealing with a step change to commercial airplane capability. And that's what Boeing achieved with the MAX 8. The tricky part to all of this is that when you're developing new air power or air capabilities, there's a process you have to go through. And it starts with, and please bear with me, but you have to conceive, design, develop, build. Okay, that's the process you go through, and every company does it. It doesn't matter if you're building submarines or airplanes or space stations. Conceive, design, develop, build. But before you can bring an airplane into service, it has to go through a very rigorous and due diligence airworthiness process, and we call that operational test and evaluation. The operational test and evaluation is what I used to do before we could bring an aircraft back into service or bring a new aircraft into service. It had to go through this very rigorous OT&E process. And quite often, if there was a step change, in the case of the MAX 8, they would like to introduce this new capability without having to increase other related costs, such as training for the aircrew, I mean, we still had to train our mechanics and maintenance folks on the engines and all that. But if you could introduce a step change aircraft without having to incur all those other costs, I mean, you're going to hit a grand slam home run. And that's what Boeing attempted to do. And you can say, well, how did they get it through the process? And here's the tricky part. And I think you heard me say about, I always go to the legislation and the regulator. The regulator should be intimately familiar with what is going on in the OT&E process. They have to sign off on it. But they delegated their regulatory authority, and Boeing self-certified. Now, it was reviewed, but the tricky part to all of this is that the changes that Boeing had to make to that airplane, it was to do with adding software to the flight control system. And the software to that flight control system was not open, transparent, and made known to either the FAA or the operators. Okay, commercial airline pilots were flying that aircraft not knowing that there was a software addition that where the aircraft would automatically start compensating for what it thought was a high alpha or high angle of attack situation. And it would push the nose down. And of course the pilots are going, what is going on? And I'll just share one more part of this because I was also a jet instructor. And whenever you're flying an airplane, whether you're an instructor, a pilot, or a student, there are three things that are always in the back of your mind. Number one is, where can I land immediately if I have to? Nothing to do with propulsion, but you know, you have to set the aircraft down, and you always kind of know all the airports around you. Almost like Sullenberger when he landed on the Hudson type thing. Like he had a good idea and he said, no, I'm going to land straight ahead on the water. The next thing is, what happens if I have a runaway trim or an uncommanded flight control input? Every properly trained pilot knows how to deal with those situations if they know what the system is all about. They didn't know what the system was all about. They didn't know how to isolate and then turn off the system and then put on a backup system. So that's what happened with the Boeing MAX 8. So just to kind of finish off, and I'll wrap this up right now, I always go back to the regulator. Why wasn't the regulator intimately familiar with what Boeing had done with the MAX 8? Well, Boeing perhaps could have done a lot better job in advertising what they actually did to that airplane with respect to the MCAS and the software and the flight control input part of it. But it's the regulator, it's to do with the culture of the company, and Boeing could self-regulate, and they looked at this as being a big plus. We're going to avoid all these extra costs incurred by doing this step change, and away they went. 2 crashes, 346 souls were lost during that. And then, of course, once that happens, then it shines a bright light in other parts of the company about, you know, should we be looking elsewhere? And then unfortunately we had another follow-on event, but I won't talk about that right now. Is that helpful at all?
It is. And in fact, I'll turn over to you, Scott, at that point. You've described a process where in pushing forward that new technology fast, there was some shortcuts being taken. And similarly, I can ask, and I know Pratt & Whitney right now is in the middle of a major recall. And it's similar in a way, right? A recall means you have to slow down, take the time. I think there's about 350 planes being recalled a year, so I'm sure there's plenty of airlines companies knocking at your door. There's plenty of shareholders knocking at your door and saying, what are you doing? Can you speak about how difficult it is, generally speaking, as part of a recall? And perhaps, how does that work compared to other industries? I don't know, like the car industry. I just received an email, I have a recall on my own car. Tell me about that process and how perhaps difficult it is to slow down when in fact, I'm sure you have pressures from everywhere to continue.
Yeah, for sure. You know, and for those in the audience that are not part of the aviation industry, you're going to hear a lot of commonality between what the three of us talk about. It's not because we had Zooms ahead of time and we aligned on talking points. It's because that collaboration that I talked about before in the standards, that's ingrained in every part of the aviation business wherever you turn. So, my answer to that, and we're going to come back to the subject for sure in more detail, and part of it is the cultural element, part of it is the governance, and how you deal with safety fundamentally, and this wonderful notion that's called the safety management system. But let's come back to that, because I want to talk more to the spirit and the culture bit of it in answer to your question. And I think what Duff is referring to is where the culture and some of those systems might have fallen short on the Boeing side. I would say, on behalf of the entire aerospace industry, that is an unfortunate example. It definitely doesn't define the industry. Again, we as an industry, including my own company, and I'm sure CAE and some of the others, we've taken those examples and we've talked, what's going on there, and we've used it as an opportunity for self-reflection. What could we be doing better? But all that said, that I myself, I'm not involved in that particular recall, but I have been involved in other engine recalls and aircraft events, and they're never easy conversations. But I know this, and I've been in front of angry customers, angry aircraft manufacturers, angry operators in our particular segments. I've been there, and it takes a lot of resilience, that's for sure. But what's resilience without knowing that you're 100% backed up by your company, by the culture, by the operating system, and knowing that what you're doing is the right thing? I can stand in front of a customer any day, any time, and look myself in the mirror and say, I will apologize to that customer. I apologize that this is happening to you. But this is the right thing to do. And in my opinion, doing anything else, or in our company's evaluation or analysts, doing something else is not the right thing to do. So we can talk about the commercial impacts of that, but this is where we are right now. And any time that I've found myself with, and I've dealt with high net worth individuals that have absolutely no concept of aviation and safety, through to very professional organizations and everything in between. 9 times out of 10, once you give them that speech, the tension comes out, everybody focuses on brass tacks. Okay, well, what does it take? Let's have that detailed conversation about getting from left to right through it. We'll come back to the what you owe me at the end of this conversation later. So it's about having the leaders, the people that understand their system, backed by the culture and the systems, and doing the right thing all the time.
What's really interesting was you just said, it reminds me of what Duff, you said at the very beginning in terms of the concerns that you had expressed in the industry, is when you have very top leadership that may not necessarily have a keen understanding of those risks. Because in that case, what you've just mentioned is a case where you know you're going to be backed up by the heads.
Absolutely. Safety in our organization, it is, there's a couple of things that we call the entry tickets to the game. Safety is one of them. Compliance is another. Our people and respect for our people is a third. In fact, there's 6 fundamental elements of our policy that we end up following. But for us, it's not about the trade of safety for money or for efficiency or anything else. Because if you don't have safety, and I see Gabor in the back. One of the things I'm going to pick on that you said this morning is, let's make sure we have regulation in place with punishment factors. You know what? As it relates to safety, the fact that you had a crash and people died, that's punishment enough. And the economic consequences actually do follow with that are far greater than what any regulatory agency could ever come up with and or administer efficiently.
So thank you, Scott. I'll turn over to you, Angela. We've talked about the issues within particular firms, how to solve them. But if I now turn over to airports, and you spoke about the ground services, we're not talking about one company, we're talking about a full ecosystem. In fact, the whole industry, you've mentioned it, is an ecosystem. But let's talk about the airports. What's really interesting, you look at the news 2023, there were 19 near misses. according to the FAA. These near misses are coming because of tower command control towers that are potentially not fully in sync with the pilots. There's all kinds of issues that could arise. We're coming out of a pandemic. The pandemic is tough. And you've said it earlier, there's a lot of job turnover, so hiring new people to come in is difficult to bring them up to speed right away. Then you need to have them synchronized. That's hard. What does it take? Take the Atlanta airport, such a massive operation. How do you implement or ensure safety concerns across the ecosystems when, as you said, you had airlines that used to have control over these subsidiaries and no longer?
Well, I think as we've said, you have to have the collaboration, and at the airport level, it's really up to the airport leader to bring that collaboration. So you have to make sure everyone is talking to each other. I mean, whether it's you have to come to this meeting and I'm serving donuts and coffee, people have to be there and talk to each other. You know, at the airport, you have competitors that you have to get into the same room and talk about the same subjects, because for the airport, it doesn't help me that airline A is doing really well, but airline C is not. I need them all to be doing well because it reflects on my airport and the wider industry, but certainly reflects on my airport. So, I mean, sometimes you have to be kind of a combination of tough and manipulative. So, the tough part is, you have to come to the meeting, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. The manipulative part is you use the relationships that your people have with their people, whether it's the airline or the ground handler or concessionaire or whomever, or government regulator. And they have to express that you do this or else, or you do this and I'll do something for you. Mm-hmm. And so you accumulate a lot of do-somethings so that you can use them when you need them. So you have to establish the relationships with both the folks that are there at the airport, the management at the airport, but also the management at the companies themselves. So you know who you have to call if there's a problem getting the compliance or cooperation on the ground, and vice versa. I mean, sometimes it's helping the one on the ground, the one at the airport, deal with the company back home, so that they're not putting themselves in trouble. You take it. I can call, I can call, the CEO. And I did this we were having a problem with something at Atlanta, and I talked to the CEO of the company, and it turned out there was a problem that the company wasn't aware of, and they tried to deny it, or they didn't realize it was happening, and I kept pushing them, and then they found out it was happening, and it was a big problem, and they fixed it. And just the postscript on that, they invited me to their annual employee meeting, Employee Appreciation Day, to talk about the situation, that something was going on that they weren't aware of, and listening to the customer is what caused them to look into it and resolve it.
Can I make
Of course, yeah.
So what you just said resonated big time with me, and quite some time ago, I was confronted with a situation where I was entrusted in doing, some type of audit or review, investigation into certain activities being undertaken by this company. And I worked on it for several months, and then I finished my report, and I submitted my report. And it was a fairly serious, number of serious findings. And I went to the company and the CEO and I said, so here's the information. It goes back several years. I said, you're going to have to go back and report what has happened here over these years. And they said, okay, great, Duff, thanks very much, good work, we'll call you when we need you next. And I said, well, first of all, you should report this to the board of directors and you should report this to the regulator, okay? You are required. And they said, yep, thanks very much, we got it. Yeah, we'll take it from here. And so I went to another person in the company and I said, they're not going to report this. And they said, no. And I said, okay. I said, and the CEO said to me, if we go forward with this at this time, and this is in fairness to the company, okay, they would not be able to find any underwriter to give them insurance. They wouldn't be able to afford insurance for the company. It would affect all kinds of things in the company as far as bonuses and pay and things like that over a number of years. And I said, I understand that. And, I said, that's fine. It's your information. Do with it what you believe you should. And so now we talk about ethics, right? What am I ethically required to do? And I'm not a whistleblower. I'm not going to put something in a brown envelope and send it to the media. But I only asked them of one thing. I said, the information is yours. You own it. But I said, please assure me that there are going to be changes in the company so that this will stop happening. And they said, you can guarantee it. Thank you. And then so anyway, but in fairness to the company, in fairness to the industry, there are pressures on CEOs and governance bodies and things that it's a tough world out there. And we talked about the 2.5% margin, profit margin that a lot of these airlines have and things like that. That it's they have to manage this the best they can, but it just comes straightforward as being these ethical dilemmas that we have. And so and there's been many of those that I've experienced over the years, but because of what you just said, Angela, and I can imagine what you had to do as well on the ethical side and what action to take, it's tough. And you have to, at the end of the day, you have to live with yourself.
So talking more, and you raised it, talking more about the whistleblower possibility, which was not the case here. But should we have a good whistleblower system? And if so, how? Because I can see pros and cons. On the one hand, it helps to uncover issues early on. Yeah. On the other hand, it can potentially lead to reckless behavior if not properly.
Perhaps, but I know Scott and Angela will have some, and I think we're all going to be of the same mind in this. So, yeah, there is that with whistleblower. But, if you look at a safety management system that most aviation and aerospace companies are supposed to have. I won't get into how many actually have a good, active, in-place safety management system. But in one of those critical, there's 9 important tenets of an SMS. One of them is a reporting culture. Okay, you have to establish a reporting culture in that in the company, and it has to be a just culture as well. So you're going to encourage reporting, but part of that is you need a confidential reporting system. And that is so any employee at any level can submit a confidential report on safety is probably what I would be interested in and airworthiness, but also on harassment and other issues related to that. And if a company has a very strong, active, confidential reporting system, and we can talk what it looks like, because they're not easy to establish, by the way, then that defines the company, and it defines the culture within the company, and that is what we're all striving to achieve. But I'm sure you have similar thoughts on that too, Angela?
Well, we had, for the airports where I led, we had the 4 guiding principles, the ones I talked about when I started. And sometimes you would have to trade off against one of those guiding principles, but you couldn't trade those off for anything else. Mm-hmm. And so now, these were county hospitals, so you had to work as a county department or a city department, so you had to live within the rules of the local government. But I said, if you could convince me that what you did wrong, you've done something wrong, now you're in trouble. If you could convince me that you did it on behalf of one of those 4 guiding principles, I will make sure that you get the least punishment possible. I might not be able to save you entirely because, there's a bigger system, but you will not get, the average punishment for that. And that resonated throughout the organization because now that's the janitor, up to the senior vice president, got that message. And it's the messaging and then carrying out the message so that people could see that's really the way it is, because people react to the rewards and punishments that they actually perceive, not what you tell them. Then it runs on its own. Then you don't have to keep pressing on it. The peer pressure, kind of the organizational atmosphere keeps that going. And then they're all whistleblowers for each other.
Yeah, I'd actually like to build on both of you because I think your heavy dose of both is right. You need the confidential channel. That's got to be protected and preserved. You also have to focus on the whole, meaning exactly what you just said. What's the general atmosphere? How do you make sure that everybody knows that they own safety? And it's okay. It's okay to speak up. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. You're in a meeting, boardroom, there's a bunch of executives sitting around, presidents are there, and you're the little engineer. Well, it's actually your job, and it's okay. And we'll actually thank you if you speak up and say, I'm not so sure I agree with that for reason X, Y, Z. Well, good. Please tell us why. I'm sure you've got something very important to hear. We want to hear about it. So, in our culture, that is very strongly encouraged. And we back it up with a very profound and robust non-retaliation policy, which deals not just with safety, but with any matter. Doesn't matter. Whatever it is you have to say, we want to hear it. It will be considered. Doesn't necessarily mean that at the end of the day, once you crunch the sausage machine and things come out the other end, that what you think or your particular opinion is by itself what we'll take action on. But everybody's going to kick in and digest that concern and figure out what's the right thing to do as a result of it.
So when we've talked about the right thing to do, one of the difficulties I can imagine is how do you reward for someone for the right thing to do when sometimes safety is, it's no accident, no incident. So when we go back again to corporations and you have the profits on the one side, the safety on the other, and all the other stakeholder relations that we want to encourage, the profits has the advantage of being measurable. We can see it. And if you've helped to contribute to greater profits, well, you can be rewarded for that, whether it's through a profit sharing plan or whatever. The safety is a different story, right? The safety is we want to avoid a bad scenario, but a good scenario where nothing happens may not necessarily be safety first either, right? Because we might have just have been lucky. And in many of these cases, these accidents are a perfect storm of events. So you need a lot of really bad things to go. And so how do you reward at the employee level good safety measures when you may not observe them in the first place?
Well, you have to have metrics for what counts as safety in your environment. So it could be, 0 incidents of X, Y, Z, depending on what your enterprise is, and you can celebrate that. We've gone 6 months, and no plane has turned onto the taxiway when another plane was on the taxiway. No one has slipped and fell. That's not going to happen. So it's fewer than 10 people have slipped and fallen in 6 months. So you can have metrics for all of the whether it's guiding principles or what's important to you as a company or an entity. You should be able to define metrics and to be able to measure against those metrics, and therefore celebrate or decry the result.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. That because of my many years in the Air Force, commanding squadrons and wings and bases, and then troops in combat over in Afghanistan, safety is endemic. It's innate in what we do. We're always doing it. But what, the military does fairly well, and I've seen some of our civilian, aviation and aerospace companies do the same, is that we celebrate and we recognize when there has been significant achievements through metrics. Like when we're measuring something, you don't just go up in front of the troops when things are going bad and tell everybody, look, we're going to do better, okay? No, whenever the team is doing well, you celebrate it, and then you have to be able to say why they're doing better, and let them know what, that they all of a sudden, and pardon the expression, it's a military expression, they know what right looks like, and they're achieving good results, and you celebrate it through awards. We used to have a quarterly honors and award presentation. The majority of them were all related to safety and safety achievements, and it reminded me of something that somewhat related, but in the commercial aviation airplane industry, does everybody here know what the number one KPI, key performance indicator, is for an airline to see how they're doing, from a business perspective? Pardon? Yeah, sort of. It's actually the pushback time. The pushback time is when the pilot, the aircraft captain, they're pretty hard-nosed. I say, okay, close the door, we're pushing back. That's because they've got to make their pushback time, because that will set everything else into motion, that they will arrive at their destination and everybody can get their connecting flights and so on and so forth. Whenever an airline does very, very well on their pushback times, man, oh man, do they have a celebration. And I don't mind that. I think it's pretty good. It's more to do with the operations side of things. We have to do the same thing on the safety and on the airworthiness side as well. Whenever we achieve very notable advancements in safety and airworthiness, then we celebrate it. And you have to have a way of doing that everybody, the last thing I'll say about this, in leadership, one of the most important aspects of good, effective leadership is what we call encouraging the heart of your team members, encouraging their heart. And the way you do that is you recognize them when they have done extraordinary service and achieved great results. And that can be on the safety side as well, safety and airworthiness.
I'll build yet again on some of that stuff. Even when we uncover something, you turn over a rock and you go, oh, what's that there? That's a little ugly. And you go through all the debates and research and reviews, and at the end of the day you come up with, well, we need to change this, we need to do this, we need to do this. That stuff is celebrated for exactly that reason, because it's something that didn't become an issue, but we found it before it did. So rewarding not just when outcomes are real, but when things were avoided that never actually ever turned into anything. We had a case recently where, like a lot of the industry, we've got an awful lot of new employees that have joined our business. It's a steep learning curve when you join aerospace. It's a complex, sophisticated, and by the way, again, for those of you not in the business, manufacturing, people think it's old-fashioned and, I'd much rather go make video games. We are the cutting edge of technology, what we do here in Montreal and in the province of La Belle Province de Québec. This industry is no more cutting edge. Like, there's nothing else that's better, higher technology out there than what we do. So it takes an awful long time for some of these employees to become competent. But, we found a couple of employees and, for reasons X, Y, Z, they weren't following their worksheets and doing their work on the floor. And, we could have punished them. We could have just trained them or retrained them. But no, what we ended up doing is we said, okay, is there something wrong with the worksheets? What did we miss? And through that process, we found improvements that we needed to make to the worksheets. We actually found a few things that were errors in them that we wanted to correct. And we helped the employees understand, and all of our employees understand, that you're very intelligent people, but when you come in on the day, your job is not to interpret and find creative ways to do things differently. Your job is to follow the worksheets step by step, because they're there for a very specific reason, because we're looking for very specific outcomes that are known, pre-programmed pre-engineered.
So we're talking about all kinds of best practices here. Can you say a few words on how easy it is to lose that safety first culture? Is it a slow decline where suddenly things get incrementally worse and it takes years and years and it drifts off? Or can it happen like that?
I think it depends on where the problem starts. The higher up the problem starts, the faster the decline. Going back to what Duff was talking about with respect to who's the CEO, who's on the board, what's their experience, I think those become, when there's changes there, and so their backgrounds change, those are some of the red flags. I mean, it doesn't mean it's bad, but that's when you have to start looking at it a bit more closely. That those kinds of changes could result in putting, particularly safety is what we're talking about, putting safety further down in the pecking order.
So let's talk about other stakeholders. And in particular, let's talk about the regulator. Duff, you've went back a couple times to the regulator, and one of the unique features of the FAA, it's a self-regulation model, right? So you're asking companies to self-regulate themselves, which clearly in the case of the MAX did not go right. Is this model fundamentally wrong? Or should we keep a similar type of model and perhaps fine-tune it? What's your view on this?
Well, simply put, I think it's a case-by-case basis. Okay, I believe in self-regulation, or what you call it, certification and things like that. But when you understand the role of the regulator and what they are legislated to do, okay, this is a law. They have to do this. And there are certain things they can, in the air traffic control world and in manufacturing, propulsion, and other parts of the industry, there are certain aspects that they can, delegate over to the company, providing that the company has demonstrated that they have everything in place to do the work in accordance with, here we go, right back up again, in accordance with the regulations and the legislation. But the regulator is still responsible for what goes on by each company if they are doing, the self-regulation. And so if I may, and is John still here? Oh, there he is. Okay, just checking, John.
He's checking if you're awake, John.
That's right. Doing, yeah. So, like I said, John and I, we've done a lot of hearings and things, and on various, airlines and MROs and manufacturers and things like that. And whenever you're dealing with the regulator, and again, here I think this is the third or fourth time I said, I always start with the regulator, the legislation, the regulator, the regulations, and then how that is brought out into the industry to the various companies. So the regulator, I'll use Transport Canada. Their role initially starts off as mentoring. Okay, they have their inspectors, and every company should have one or two assigned Transport Canada inspectors. They're there to keep an eye on things and to help them, especially if they're going to do new things and to help them along. But they're there to make sure that everything's going well, and they're going to do little audits and inspections, and they're going to, pop up, we're going to show up every Tuesday and Thursday, and then, and so on and so forth. And the company expects them. If the inspector doesn't show up, they actually call and say, hey, I thought you were coming over today. Where are you, type thing, because they want to show them, the company wants to show the inspector something. If something is not going well, the inspector will help the company get back on the right path, or at least recognize what they're not doing well. And in the industry, we call it non-conformance. We can call it non-compliance, or the biggie is a violation. Okay, so that's kind of like the way it goes. But you're now progressing on an issue that the company is definitely having trouble with. And if the inspector is unable to get the company through this rough patch, as we say, and there's going to have to be a more deliberate action plan put in place, that what they're going to do is they're going to bring in an investigator. And the investigator is going to define and determine, and I know this goes on in manufacturing and on the air traffic side as well, or on the airport side. They will look to see the seriousness of the difficulty, or in fact, if there has been, as we start off, there's the non-conformance, and then there's the non-compliance, and then the violation. The next step after that is the enforcement officer arrives. The enforcement officer is going to see if there are going to be formal charges brought against either an individual, the company, and so on. But this is a long mentorship type process. It starts off mentoring, and then it actually gets to the point where the company just cannot get through this rough patch, and we're going to have to change the way the company is fundamentally operating. And so that's what that whole process is all about. Now, throw into that, if a company is doing, self-regulation, if they are actually certifying their own work, which is supposed to be done by the regulator, the regulator certification, you're running into a lot of problems here. And I can't imagine, I've only seen a couple of, there's a few airports out there that could probably do their own self-regulation certification. There's even a fewer number of manufacturers and aerospace industries that can do it. But it's a real tough job that if they want to delegate, down to the company's self-regulation, as they did with Boeing with the MAX 8, I mean, do I need to say any more about how bad things can go on that?
But I guess one of the questions, follow-ups on that, and I think I'll direct it to you, Scott, is you've mentioned the state-of-the-art technological progress. How do you get regulators to follow on that progress? Do you empower regulators to have the same type of training? Do you pay them to have that type of training? I mean, we're talking about now, how do you apply what you've just described, Duff, in the environment where you have to evaluate that latest technology, which is much more complex than it used to be 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, a couple of observations there. I'm going to back up a little bit to the prior question in order to set the stage, because self-regulation is an absolute. It's not this, well, here you go, sayonara, see you tomorrow, you're good to go. I'll use what goes on in the four walls of my particular company. We are self-regulating. We do have a delegation from Transport Canada. In fact, we celebrated 25 years of delegation last year with them. But it's not absolute. There's certain models of what we do, and Pratt & Whitney Canada, we've certified over 200 engine models in our history, which is probably a world record, I'm thinking, by the time you add up all the different engine models that are out there. But not all of them was done in isolation, and not everything we do is just by ourselves. There's bits and pieces that are regulated. It's not the whole thing. And that system is based on, yes, the compliance. It's also based on the competency of the delegates. It's based on a heavy element of trust and dialogue with the regulator on a regular basis, and the individual accountability that Duff talked about. So when you talk about new technologies, well, new technologies fit in that space where the regulator doesn't delegate. They keep that to themselves, and rightfully so. We wouldn't push them to delegate that, because we know that it's up to us to show that we've got the competency, that we demonstrate compliance, that we're trustworthy, and that we've got the individuals that are accountable in order to merit that delegation. And by the way, those individuals are accountable not to us. They're accountable to the Minister of Transport directly. And they're held accountable by law, specifically. So they bear a very, very, very heavy burden in what they do. And, we manage them, manage them is not the right word. We treat them as individuals of utmost respect and authority within our four walls, because not only are they representatives of our company, internal, in a lot of cases, we do something even different than some other companies. Those same people actually happen to be the project managers. They manage the money as well. They manage the projects, and they're dual-hatted. And they do that extremely well, because we've got the culture that goes and drives that and facilitates that, and we've got the relationship with the regulator and the transparency.
And I guess building on that, maybe turning over to you, Angela, you just mentioned that the culture can slip very fast. Should the regulation be dynamic in the sense that once you see that red flag that you just mentioned, maybe everything's okay, but that's the point where, if anything, you want to be more active on the regulation side to ensure in this period of higher uncertainty that it's time to crank up, in a way, the...
Yeah, absolutely. And it was occurring to me that this could be someplace where AI could be useful to the regulator. Because regulators, they're part of government, and government is always going to have a budget issue. And regulation is not very sexy, so they're not first in the, in getting funds and resources. Doing some research as to, what are appropriate red flags or what are potential risk issues, and then kind of fanning out and paying attention to that within the industry. Like looking at CEO and board appointments and who's doing this and who's doing that, could be something that the regulator could focus on, so that they would know where they need to intervene and take another look. And that would be dynamic, because what those red flags might be would be different. Particularly with technology, that what is someone trying to do, institute new technology. I think about the eVTOLs, the electric vertical takeoff and landing machines that are in development, and the FAA is taking a very long time to do the certification, because it's not Pratt and Whitney doing it. It's not, well, Boeing was doing it, but I think Boeing has dropped out. So it is going to vary, depending on the trust they might have in the company. But even a company that's very much trusted, they still have to look for potential areas of change that might cause additional risk.
Yeah. Can I add a comment to that? And I'll just add like a little footnote to this. What I've seen as well, and Scott, I'm sure, and you've seen it in Angela, that the regulator, they're great folks, and they're very talented, they're very competent, but in some cases, industry knows more about a certain part of the technology than the regulator does. Yeah, and so the regulator will actually end up going to the individuals that you mentioned, Scott, and they will go for a learning session with industry, and then it's a knowledge transfer back and forth. One good example, and we haven't really touched on it yet, but it's unmanned air taxis. Okay, and we have a company right here. I helped bring Whisk Aerospace into Montreal a number of years ago, and they're going to be producing an unmanned autonomous air taxi. Okay, now just think about that. I mean, there are heads exploding in every regulator office, in the FAA and Transport Canada and all over the world. They're kind of going like, man, oh man, how are we going to do this? Like these little yellow unmanned things flying around with 6 or 8 passengers on board between, Mirabel and Pierre Elliott Trudeau or to Quebec and all over the place. But they're not manned. There'll be, some type of oversight and all that stuff. But it's the industry that's moving forward on that. And just like other unmanned aerial vehicles, the regulator had to ramp up, to understand what this new technology was all about. And they were coming to industry to say, look, can you help us out here? We'll develop the regulations and the legislation, but we need to understand what you're doing. So that's where there's great collaboration there between industry and the regulator.
Yeah, and I think another example of that is if you take a step back and you look at ICAO, which we're very privileged, by the way, to have headquartered right here in Montreal. ICAO and its subcommittees albeit some people perceive as a very slow grinding bureaucracy, is a fantastic place where regulators or policymakers come together with the industry in order to talk about all these subjects and to put it all out on the table and then come up with recommendations that then go back to the regulators themselves that they find very, very, very informative. And by the way, the regulators participate in that too. Yep. So it kind of comes back to that collaboration. And, again, my point, and I'm going to be pedantic about it, about the evolution versus the revolution. Sometimes that feels very slow to people. And I can completely understand the impatience that society as a whole might sometimes feel with the aviation industry. We're doing it for the right reasons. And, my famous, whenever I'm with family, friends, because I'm the only one that works in the aviation industry amongst them, I tell them, look, when's the last time you had a problem with your iPhone or your car or whatever gizmo that you're playing with? Would you want that to happen when you're on an airplane? Well, no. Well, okay. Well, that's why things move slowly. We do take our time because we want to make sure that what technologies we adopt, what policies we're using, are really, really well thought out. And I go to these meetings and, I'm a business development guy, so I like things that are fast and furious and fun. Sometimes it's like watching the paint dry a little bit in these meetings, but it's okay. It's for the right reasons. People are being very diligent, talking about all the issues, making sure that all the information is out on the table and that it's discussed, understood, and that the decision makers involved in that process are fully informed and are taking decisions with that in mind.
Thank you. So last question for you, and then I'll turn over to you. And so if you have questions, please, by all means, if you can position yourself next to the mics. Last question for you is, when you look at, let's say, the giants like Airbus, Boeing, they're huge. I mean, we're talking about national champions here. If you look at Boeing, you look at the big factories, we're looking at thousands of jobs here. Have we reached a point where we have a too big to fail? You've mentioned, Duff, about the insurance situation here. Have we reached a point where if you look at, if there is an issue, no stakeholder wants to speak up just because the costs of speaking up are potentially too big? So is this potentially, we haven't discussed it yet, but are we in a too big to fail situation?
Well, it all depends on what your definition of fail is. I've heard it say, this is, these aren't my words, but I've heard it said that Boeing is already failing. Okay, I mean, are they going to shutter the doors and lock it up and send everybody home? No, they're not. Airplane making in the U.S. will continue, but a company like Boeing, as we sit here and discuss it, is going through hugely significant restructure and changes. And they're laying off 17,000 employees. In fact, the notices just went out yesterday, I believe. And that is going to continue through until January. And they're looking at divesting significant, and it breaks my heart because one of the offices that reported to me here in Montreal is Jeppesen, Montreal. And that's a Boeing-owned company, and they do amazing work. I know all the employees there, but Boeing is looking at divesting Jeppesen, which is here in Montreal and in Gothenburg, Sweden, and then down in Denver, Colorado. So it all depends on what you mean by failure or failed. Are they too big to fail? I won't comment on that, but I will say that they're going through huge changes right now to make the company, this is going to sound kind of strange, to make the company viable again. That almost sounds like one of those red baseball caps they wear down in the States. Make the company viable again. Yeah, so anyway, that's what Boeing is trying to do right now. And again, we're talking about, Boeing has 170,000 direct employees, millions of indirect employees here in North America, but also in Europe and Southeast Asia and things like that. So Boeing will continue, but it's just a matter in what form, and what are they going to be doing in the future? Are they going to be doing space and launch? We'll wait and see. Are they going to be doing defense? Maybe not all the programs, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't say they're too big to fail. I would say they're too big to disappear, and they will continue forward in a different arrangement by whatever the board and the government. The government has a big say in this, as do the unions.
But I would say that, unfortunately, this is a good story for the regulators, for the stakeholders, for the next time they feel, gee, we can't do this because they're too big to fail. It's too important. Look what happened. Look what happened. And I think this will be an example for years to come. I think it will strengthen regulation. I mean, I hope it doesn't. Not that we need more regulation, but I hope it emboldens the regulator and compliance that this stuff counts. Even a Boeing can screw it up.
Yeah.
I would say any company that's worth their salt right now is looking at the Boeing situation and, like I said, looking in the mirror and using it as an example of, okay, what can I learn from this and what can I be doing? Like every one of those opportunities, which is, I like to believe, is the fundamental DNA within the aerospace industry of taking every event. It doesn't matter whether or not it's a competitor or you, it's irrelevant. It is an event to learn something from. Let's use it in that particular spirit. Learn, adapt, and work with the regulators to understand, well, how do we continue to evolve in order to make things better and better and safer and safer.
Thank you. Gibber, I think.
Certainly it's a very interesting discussion, and obviously safety comes first in aviation. Nobody denies that. And in my activity with passengers, I always tell them, if the pilot said that something was wrong, it was probably right, because pilots have no interest in deceiving passengers. So I just want to be clear, whenever I'm talking about punishment, that's not about the airline staff, it's not about the pilots, it's about the corporate level. It was also fascinating to hear how you describe about this relationship between the industry and the regulator. Something that on the flip side, more on the Canadian Transportation Agency side, I've also been observing, but with some concern, and I'm not the only one who's concerned about it. During and after the pandemic, House of Commons Transport Committee conducted a quite broad study of the industry and how the pandemic was affecting it. If you remember, its report released in July 2021, recommendation 21, was asking how the Canadian transportation is avoiding regulatory capture. So the question I'm coming to is, yes, of course, there's this issue when you describe trust relationship. I'm a bit scratching my head because shouldn't we have a system that is not based on whom we trust, whom we know between the regulator and industry, but rather on some objective criteria? That's question number one. To me, as someone who is born in Europe, it sounds awfully like a kind of backroom deal happening, even if not intentionally. When what is determining this kind of relationship is personal human relationships, as opposed to formal criteria that even, as you mentioned, AI would be able to handle. That's part one.
Well, let's start with that. That's a good question.
Okay. I have a second question, but go on.
So, I'm the one that invoked the thought of trust. So let me clarify that. If this is not without documentation, policies, rules, and audits, training, and all the necessary mechanisms that go with that. All I meant by trust is the following. We could have an event and the regulator comes to see us on any given day, and we've got an obligation to provide them daily reports of everything that we're aware of. We could say nothing. We could. But we don't. And it's not the fact that you've got a regulation, a policy, a audit, a whatever that causes us to go report stuff. It's got nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that we're human beings and we know that this is a serious issue, right? And we know that, okay, yes, there's policies, there's laws, there's delegation, there's training. We know that that's all there. At the end of the day, fundamentally, it's the right thing. We saw something, we observed something somewhere in our fleet that happened somewhere, had nothing maybe really to do with us, doesn't matter. We believe strongly in the transparency with the regulator that in turn is the trust that they give us through the delegation. That's all I meant by that, is that it's what's that fundamental dynamic in the background, which is on top of all the piles of paperwork that goes with managing this system. I'm not sure if that made it clear. Maybe Duff, you've got something to add to that, please.
Well, yeah, a quick comment on this. You know, because of my background, you know, as a test pilot and with the tribunal and then a bunch of other things, you know, I look at the regulatory framework for what it is. And, you know, you have to remember that today we're talking about aviation. But you know, there's rail. Just think back to Lac-Mégantic. You know, we do maritime marine. Okay, here in Canada, Transport Canada does. And so there is a huge volume of regulations that John and I became very familiar with. And for us, it's very, you know, pardon me for using this word, but it's almost transactional, because when a company is awarded an operating certificate by the Minister of Transport for that company and that business and that operation, it is very specific in there about what this company is required to do with respect to, you know, regulations and compliance and conformance and so on and so forth. And there is a huge process to go through to be awarded that certificate. And that goes on the wall. You know, as soon as you walk in the company front door, it's right there on the wall, their operating certificate. And that's what John and I used to pore over when we're doing hearings and things like that. So it's very transactional. And if a company is going to have that certificate suspended or pulled, then that's what comes before the tribunal, and we have to, you know, adjudicate if this is the proper thing to do. But yeah, so that's that aspect of, you know, the regulations and that part. But I will throw one of the intangibles in there too, and that is the trust and confidence piece, okay? Because in our business, in aviation, I mean, I've experienced it myself, not on me, but I've seen it happen, where, as they say, trust and confidence leaves on horseback and it comes back on foot, okay? It is quick to disappear. And, you know, the other thing we say is trust and confidence is easier maintained than regained. Once it's gone, it's gone. And that affects what the public thinks, and it also affects what the regulator thinks as well. Even though you may be fully compliant, they will see that there is a lack of trust and confidence for whatever reason. And that is, you know, worth everything to a company.
Thank you. I know you have a second question, but let's get some others, and I'll come back to you if we have time. Hugen?
Thank you. It sounds like that the panelists from the first session is here to queuing the question because we are not happy about the change of the chairs, why we didn't get the fancier one. My comment is actually, it's not comments, it's questions. It's related to the comments from the Duff that in the very beginning of the sessions about the board of directors, that how we have to form the board of directors to solve a lot of issues. So one thing striking to me was, because given all the discussion today about new environment, the ethics standards is changing, activists and activist investors and regulations, a lot of them change, and then you call that we need more industry experts on the board rather than bring the new perspectives in. And I'm just curious that why you believe that that will solve all the questions we've been talking since the morning, and any insights about that.
Okay, I'll try and zero in on what I think you're posing here. So the governance of any company, especially a large company like an OEM or an airline and things like that, it's very broad and diverse. They need to have expertise on the board that understands they need to have legal counsel, they need to understand the legal aspect of it, they need to understand HR and IT and the whole breadth of what that company is required to do as a company. In aviation and aerospace, they need to have, you know, individuals on that board that have an innate understanding of the core deliverable of that company. If it's an airport, if it's an air traffic control company, if it's a propulsion, things to do with propulsion, the board of directors, they need to have that level of expertise and experience on the board, because that's what they do. They provide that strategic direction and vision, going forward, that the president and CEO now is given, and he can now lead the company. I don't know if that helps at all about, the different makeup of the boards, or the board.
The questions is coming a lot from the quite new questions and new challenges coming in. Yeah. And then not everything was quite understandable within the organization. There's a new perspective that comes in because there's a lot of questions we really don't know what to answer within the industry. And having that only those similar, I was going to very similar type of knowledge within the board may be, kind of making the journey to find a solution is more difficult. Yeah. Whether this is not the time that actually you need a more diverse view, although it's not really familiar, but something striking and disruptions and coming and for the new solution. It's not this is not what I believe, but it's more about why this particular types of board of director is actually better serving the answer to the questions that we actually raised today. That was the thing.
So maybe he's come to save me a couple of times here. So Duff, maybe back at you, my friend. I'm not sure Duff's point is really about perspectives in so much as fundamental understandings of the technology, how you manufacture, deliver. What are the quality systems in behind that? What are the safety management systems? What are the financial systems and reporting systems that go with that? How do audit structures work, both financial, product, general safety? All these things, it's nice to have people that have opinions on boards, but if they don't understand any of that in the aerospace world, you know what? They're not doing your board a service, because ultimately that minute that board has to deal with something as critical as, and I'll come back to myself, let's make it about an engine recall, what we call an airworthiness directive.
Well, and
that means something.
And I can say as a former airport director, when the airport is part of local or state government, that's one of the problems we have, that your board, which is the city council and the mayor, they have no idea about, or they may have no idea about either the business of airports, why an airport is different from the public works department. You're dealing now with customers, not taxpayers. You're dealing with airlines who can choose to use your airport or not, or how much to use it. So there's a lot more discretionary decision making, which does not mirror usually anything else or not much else within the city or the county. Yeah. Now, this may not be, and frankly, you have to hide behind the regulator a lot of times because, your board, your city council or mayor may want you to do something which is out of compliance. And they may not want to listen to you, so you call the regulator on them.
Yeah.
But I think a good example of that, and which came from you actually in our early chats, is a fatigue management policy, right? Of boards who knew about that underlying business and implemented a new policy precisely on fatigue.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good example. And if I may come back just to the board here, just briefly. That, I've seen all different kinds of boards, and boards have a lot of discretion about, who they can bring in as, like, I used to serve on a strategic advisory council, for a couple of board of directors. I wasn't a board member, but they needed somebody to come in and sit with them and just help them understand better about, what was going on in their company. And I think that's great, to have a strategic advisory group or council or whatever. And I encourage boards to do that. But there are some boards, and I have nothing against, in fact, I love family-owned businesses. And quite often, the family is either chairing the board or they have, 2 or 3 positions on the board, which is great because they have a vested interest to make sure that company, continues to do well. And they will bring on the proper other board members and expertise and things like that. But back to your point about fatigue management and fatigue risk management. This has been a very significant number of observations by the Transportation Safety Board and a number of other investigations. And the one thing that I used to love doing, it was my favorite topic, and thanks for bringing it forward again, is if I was going to sit down and talk to a CEO before I went in to do a deep dive into the company, I would ask that CEO and perhaps even the board member, the guy, the individual, the man or woman who heads up the safety committee of that board, I would ask them for their strategic policies that guide the company forward. And I was looking for that fatigue management aspect, a policy. And the policy just says that the company will have a fatigue risk management protocol in place. And then whenever you have a policy, then it goes down to directives. Then from a directive, it goes down to like that protocol, and then procedures, and then checklists. And so it's just a natural waterfall all the way down. And if they told me that they had this beautiful, and I would read it, and I'd see the fatigue risk management policy, I'd immediately go out onto the floor and see if I could find out where it is, like on the front line. And sometimes it was gone. It was nowhere to be found. And I'd say, well, that's good. They have all the policies in the CEO's office, but they don't exist anywhere else in the company. But I also saw the opposite, where I would be down talking to the frontline workers, and they were telling me about how careful they are about fatigue management and so on and so forth. And I'd say, that warms my heart. I'm really glad to see that you have limits on how long you can work and how many days off you get and all that stuff. And then I would go back up the top and I'd say, I want to congratulate you on your fatigue risk management policy. And they go, what are you talking about? I say, you don't have a policy on fatigue management? They go, no. I say, well, you better get one in place because they're doing it very well down on the shop floor. But anyway, that kind of shows you how it can go back and forth and up and down.
We'll end here because I think we're right on time, and I know there's additional questions, and I invite you to come and speak to our panelists. But let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Actually, I hear we have 5 extra minutes. Wonderful. So we have one question.
Yeah.
But I saw, yes, you were standing up.
Again, Mark Rioux from Carleton University. Very briefly, just to add to what the panelists said about the issue of delegating the authority to certify products to a manufacturer. And my comment is based on my 35 years of experience in the federal government, 16 in Transport Canada. A regulator should ask 2 questions before delegating the authority to a manufacturer. The first one, is the regulatee well informed? Yep. And the second question, is the regulatee well-intentioned? And if you don't meet these 2 criteria, if you delegate, you do it at your own peril. Exactly. Now, you might ask, why on earth would a regulator delegate the authority to a manufacturer to certify its own products? The main reason is resource constraints.
I wasn't sure if you wanted to go there or not, because the reason why is a very tricky conversation.
Yeah. So Transport Canada, like the FAA, EASA, does not have enough money in its budget to do everything it's supposed to do. So it has to prioritize, and it has to focus on the high-risk areas. And so in Canada, Transport Canada does not have enough inspectors to go to every single organization in the industry and inspect on a regular basis or even on a random basis. That's why we have safety management systems, security management systems, and so on. So that's a way that the regulator has had to use in order to try to reach the highest compliance with the regulations within the allocation that has received in terms of budget. So that's the reality. That's what really is.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And just to pile on, if you think about it, Canada has, I think we have 8,000 commercial airline pilots. Every one of them has to do an annual pilot proficiency check, via Transport Canada. Transport Canada delegates pilots on every airline to do that, and on behalf of the minister, and that delegated testing pilot reports directly to the minister. Like, he's responsible. He's under the employment of the minister when he's doing rides on his own squadron pilots. And the same thing goes on with other, maintenance and engineering qualifications as well.
Gaber, are you able to ask yours in 20 seconds?
I was wondering if probably as experts you remember the story about the Mexican game, about flights from Canada taking off from Mexico, fraudulently reporting the amount of fuel on board, knowing full well they had to land in Midway. It was a big CBC story at the time, I think reported by Aaron Zeltzman about 8 years ago, roughly. I won't mention which airline, but I'm sure you know. One of the issues there was pilots were doing their job, they were trying to report it, the company was covering up. They also contacted Transport Canada. They also were bearing the issue because always was flights departing from Mexico. Even though they were flying to Canada with Canadian passengers on board, somehow the Minister of Transport Canada was washing their hands. Pilot was talking about revolving door between Inspector of Transport Canada and pilots at their particular company. CBC did report the airlines aspect, never reported on the Transport Canada aspect. As experts and as those who very much advocate from what seems to be more a Canadian model for regulation. I mean, the European one is, the European model is basically if something goes wrong, somebody goes to jail. Simple as that. But you live in a more liberal, kind of more trust-based one. How do you explain what happened in the Mexican game and how it could happen? I would really love to hear your thoughts in a non-judgmental perspective. Just.
Yeah, I heard about it, but I'm not all that familiar with it. And I should probably not comment on it, to be quite honest, but it's a good one. And, along with discipline and punishment and all that stuff that goes on in the industry, again, I'll come back to John and myself when we do hearings, or when we did hearings with the tribunal. The tribunal has a lot of discretion, and it could be an airline company comes to the tribunal and says, "Look, we're being too harshly dealt with here by the minister, and we want a hearing." So the tribunal will have the hearing, and it's a quasi-judicial administrative hearing. All testimony is given under oath, evidence is given, and so on and so forth. And at the end of it, the tribunal can either uphold the minister's enforcement action, they can overturn it and say that they don't support it, and each party has 30 days to appeal. And then, believe it or not, the tribunal will do the appeal, but it's 3 new members that will do it. But the tribunal can also either increase or decrease the fine involved. And I've only done it once, and gee, I have to be careful here. It was verging on the line. We're not a criminal tribunal. We can't hear criminal charges, but it was a reckless, flagrant disregard of published regulations and procedures. And I chose, as the presiding member, to increase the penalty quite substantially. So that's what the minister or the tribunal can do. And, that's how we support both, the minister and that process, but also how we support the industry. And I don't know what your track record is, John. I think I was 50-50 about, not that I kept track. I don't number them and I don't keep track. But if somebody says, well, you must have always ruled in favor of the minister, I'd say, no, not at all. We would hear it. We were unbiased. We would listen to all the testimony, and then we would render a decision. And then that decision would hold unless one of the parties wanted to appeal it. But that's the way it worked, and so that's how we worked within the industry on that side of, not legislating, but dealing with fines and enforcement and things like that.
All right, Duff, Angela, Scott, thank you. A second round of applause. And I believe, hold on, we have a few closing words.
Oh, yes. I'm going to be very, very quick. I'll just say thank you very much. I want to thank the people who have helped also to make this possible. So one person you've seen running around, she's in the back here, Joelle Moses. She's a person you've heard from a lot. Joelle is our outreach coordinator. She's a fantastic scholar, and she happens to be on my research team also and working with these over 400 participants that we have in our research project. Thank you to the comms team for helping us get the word out about this event. To the faculty club staff, thank you very much for everything you've done. And of course, the AV team here today, thank you very much for everything you've worked on. Thank you very much to our panelists. I'm just, my mind is so full, and I have so many things that I'm going to be thinking about and wanting to talk with all of you about. I'm going to be driving you all crazy. But I'm extremely grateful to all of you, and I would name you all, but I know everyone wants to take a little bit of a break. One final thing I'll say, apropos your closing remarks today, Def. One thing I don't add about what I do typically is that I am the disciplinary officer for the Faculty of Management. And I was, everyone's in trouble. No, I was thinking about how wonderful it is that we could come together and have these positive but challenging conversations, because we're a learning institution. And this is about learning. And that's what's, when we think about compliance versus non-compliance, you know, you have these sort of ranges of decisions that are made. I do too, but when I'm making my ranges of decisions, I get to do it thinking the primary goal here is it's a learning opportunity. It's a learning opportunity for everyone involved, for the student, for whoever else might be involved. And I'm so grateful that David Laidley, sitting here in the front, has made it possible for us to share in these learning opportunities through the Laidley Center. And thank you for your candidness and for being here. Really appreciate it. All right, I'll turn it over. Nikita has some fun things to tell you about the Laidley Center quickly coming up. And as you know, Scott and his team at Pratt & Whitney, one of whom is here, has been working with me on developing the case, are sponsoring our ethics case, international ethics case competition in March. So again, thank you for that. And Nikita to close. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay. I'm really delighted that you chose to spend your day with us today. I want to let you know that on Monday, you're going to get an evaluation. Please fill it out. By taking the 60 seconds will help to ensure that we continue making programming that is interesting and relevant and meets your needs. The Laidley Center has many exciting events coming up next semester. If you're not already on our mailing list, please join it. Follow us on LinkedIn. You'll know all that we're doing. And then very finally, enjoy the networking cocktail. Please meet some new people, have some bites to eat, and Joelle is going to be at the door giving you your tickets for the bar. So thank you very much.